A loving wife, a perfect marriage. But one encounter changes everything. James discovers that his wife, Catherine, is hiding something important. Late nights, expensive gifts from her boss, and mysterious trips. The climax, a party where James witnesses her close relationship with her boss. Is it just business? Or is betrayal tearing their marriage apart? The answer lies behind closed doors. Will James dare to uncover the truth? Your wife is no longer yours. She's mine. My wife's boss approached me and said this. James was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, deeply inhaling the aroma of the drink that usually calmed him. But today, it felt different. Catherine, his wife, had left home even earlier than usual. She left a short note on a piece of paper. Long day today. Don't wait up for me until late evening. He looked at the note and felt something unusual. It wasn't her first late meeting, but his intuition told him that something wasn't right this time. Recently, she often looked tired and sometimes even distracted. James unfolded the newspaper, trying to distract himself, but it was hard to focus. Thoughts swirled in his head. What's going on with Catherine? Her behavior had changed, but the reasons remained a mystery. Evening came sooner than he expected. When the clock struck 9, the door finally opened and Catherine walked in. "Oh, you're still up?" Her voice sounded a bit surprised. "No, I was waiting for you." James set aside his cup of tea. "How was your day?" "Tough." She quickly took off her heels and walked into the kitchen. "I didn't even get a proper lunch. So much to do." "What kind of tasks are those?" James asked calmly, but his gaze betrayed his curiosity. "We're working on a big project with Richard. There's a lot to sort out," Catherine replied almost mechanically. James watched her carefully as she placed her bag on the table and quickly spread out some papers, not even glancing at him. Something about her behavior felt artificial. The following days passed in the same rhythm. Catherine left early, came back late, and always had an excuse. One time, while she was in the bathroom, James accidentally noticed her phone lying on the table. He had never looked through her personal belongings before, but something made him reach out this time. He didn't have time to do anything. Catherine came out of the bathroom. "Oh, are you looking at my phone?" Her voice had a tinge of tension, though she tried to smile. "No, I just saw it light up," James replied calmly, pretending to be more interested in his newspaper. "Okay." Catherine quickly grabbed the phone and put it in her bag. That moment left him with even more questions. What is she hiding? On Sunday, when they decided to have lunch together at a restaurant, James noticed another detail. Catherine kept checking her phone. She laughed at his jokes, but her attention was constantly distracted. "Is everything okay?" he asked when she looked at the screen yet again. "Yeah, sorry, it's just Richard sending revisions for the project." James nodded, but his suspicions continued to grow. The next morning, he decided to visit Catherine's office. He wasn't interested in what exactly she was working on, but he wanted to understand if everything was as she said. At the office, he met her colleague Angelica. "Oh, James, hi," she greeted him. "What brings you here?" "I just came to drop off some documents for Catherine," he replied, showing a folder. "Documents?" Angelica looked surprised. "She's working from home today." James froze. "From home?" he repeated, trying to mask his confusion. "Yes," she said. Richard allowed her to work remotely sometimes to focus better. James forced a smile and thanked her. But inside, everything was boiling. If she's working from home, then why did she leave so early? And most importantly, where did she go? When he returned, the house was empty. She wasn't home. James sat in a chair, trying to gather his thoughts. He knew he had to wait for the moment when the truth would reveal itself, but the tension was becoming unbearable. Catherine returned home, as usual, late. James noticed immediately. She was completely different. Instead of her usual office attire, she was dressed in a stylish black blazer, a white blouse, and a short skirt that accentuated her slender figure. She had also started wearing very elegant black stockings. Red lipstick on her lips added a certain allure to her appearance, and her hair was carefully styled. She looked tired, but not in the usual way after a long day at work. It struck James as odd. Why dress up so much for work? It all seemed very strange. "You look a bit tired," James said, watching her as she walked into the kitchen. "Yes, it was truly a tough day," Catherine replied, taking off her shoes. Mr. Richard allowed me to work from home, but I couldn't concentrate, so I went to a co-working space. James glanced at her again, trying to understand why she had changed so much. She was still as attractive as ever, but his gut feeling told him something was wrong. For the past few weeks, Catherine had been acting strangely. She had started paying extraordinary attention to her appearance, and her behavior was more closed off than before. Co-working? James asked, trying to sound indifferent. That makes sense. And how was the meeting with Richard? It was productive, Catherine said, lowering her gaze. We discussed all the details, and he was pleased. James nodded, observing her reaction. Something about her words felt off, but he decided not to make an issue of it for now. He realized that in this state, she was unlikely to open up, and pressing the matter further would only create more tension. You look tired. Maybe you'd like to rest for a bit? I ordered food. Don't worry, everything will be ready, James said, trying to make the atmosphere more comfortable. Yes, I'll try to rest a little, she replied and went to another room. James stayed in the kitchen, reflecting on what was happening. He had learned that she had been spending more time lately with her boss, Richard. Her strange behavior couldn't just be a coincidence. He needed to find out what was really going on, but how? The next day, James decided to take a break and invited Catherine to visit their friends. The weekend was approaching, and it seemed like a good opportunity to spend time together, away from work and doubts. He hoped that being with friends might ease the tension and help him understand what was really going on with his wife. How about we visit Julia and Jason this weekend? They've invited us, and it might help us relax, James suggested. Catherine seemed hesitant, but eventually agreed. She wasn't in the best mood but understood that James was worried about her and didn't want to cause him additional problems. All right, she agreed, but let's not stay too long. I have a lot of things to do. Of course, no problem, James replied. When they arrived at their friend's house, the atmosphere was easy and relaxed. Julia and Jason, as always, tried to create a welcoming environment, and everything seemed quite peaceful. They chatted, laughed, and James tried to act naturally. Catherine also began to relax a little, but her gaze occasionally drifted to her phone, which didn't escape James's notice. Why are you checking your phone so often? He asked while they were sitting on the couch with their friends. Nothing special, Catherine quickly put it away. Just checking messages from Richard. James didn't reply, but new questions crept into his mind. How had it happened that all her recent actions and conversations were tied to him? That evening, James tried to be as inconspicuous as possible but felt on edge. Catherine acted as though she were trying to hide something. She was distracted when her work was mentioned and spent more time on her phone. James couldn't help but notice that she had become less open and more withdrawn, a stark contrast to the person she used to be. That evening, James couldn't shake the feeling of unease. He sat in the room with their friends, but all his attention was focused on Catherine. She seemed changed. Her behavior was so different from her usual self that it made him doubtful. Julia noticed this and even tried to change the subject to ease the tension. How are you, Catherine? Maybe you're just overworked? Work can be exhausting, Julia asked, smiling warmly. Everything's fine. There's just a lot going on at work right now, but I'm glad I can find time for friends. I also wanted to tell you all that my career is picking up, and my boss, Richard, said he's considering promoting me for my excellent work, Catherine replied, but her voice lacked the warmth that was once always present in her responses. James realized that her words sounded cheerful and perfect. Instead of feeling happy for Catherine's success, he felt a growing sense of anxiety. On the one hand, he was proud of her achievements, but on the other, something unsettled him. Now that her career was taking off, Catherine seemed increasingly out of reach, and every day, it felt like the distance between them was growing. When Julia brought up Richard, James felt his heart tighten. It turned out her new boss had become more than just a boss. He was a very important person in her life. Catherine even admitted that he had promised her a promotion based on their joint work. Richard and I work a lot together. He treats me very well. These are big opportunities for me. I want to continue growing in the company, but it's a challenge for me. I need to work even more with Richard and learn from him. He's such a strong person, Catherine said, sitting on the couch, her voice full of genuine admiration. James swallowed hard. not knowing how to react. All these words seemed overly enthusiastic to him. Richard was a successful man, and Catherine was in his orbit. It seemed she was becoming increasingly important to him. Why didn't you tell me about this earlier? James tried to ask calmly, though inside, he felt something beginning to boil. I just wanted to surprise you, Catherine replied without meeting his gaze. James couldn't hide his surprise. The feeling of jealousy wouldn't leave him. He looked at his wife, and it became hard to breathe. Her professional success was evident. He hadn't received a promotion in a long time, and had even begun to envy Catherine for her achievements. Now she might earn more than him, putting James in an uncomfortable position. He started to wonder what he would do about it. That night, after returning home, James couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, thinking about everything that had happened and couldn't find answers to his questions. Why had she changed so much? Could it just be career success altering her? He began to wonder if there was more to these changes that he hadn't noticed. In the morning, after Catherine left for work, James couldn't contain himself. He opened her laptop, where she had left several messages. Messages from Richard were very personal, and although they weren't overly explicit, James felt that there was something more to them than just professional correspondence. He felt like he was at a dead end. James felt increasingly isolated. He envied Catherine's success, but couldn't express his feelings. At times, he felt as though their marriage and his own life were being pushed to the background, and an invisible wall stood before him, one he couldn't overcome. Over the next few days, James observed Catherine's behavior and began noticing new little things that had previously escaped his attention. She became more reserved, her gaze frequently avoided his, and their conversations revolved solely around her work. James began to understand that she was clearly hiding something, but he couldn't pinpoint what exactly. Then, a few days later, when Catherine left for another meeting with Richard, James decided to act. He went to her company's office, hoping to find answers to his questions. And there, he discovered more than he had expected. It turned out that Catherine and Richard were not just working together but spending time outside the office. Catherine had started appearing in places where James had never seen her before. Catherine woke up early in the morning, as usual. James heard her quietly getting ready for the day. He lay in bed, glancing at the clock. He noticed she had become increasingly busy. Just a few months ago, Catherine wasn't so preoccupied, but now it was as if she was in a new reality where work had become her primary focus. James quietly got out of bed and approached her from behind. As soon as he wrapped his arms around her waist, Catherine flinched and immediately turned around. "Why are you sneaking up on me like that?" she said, visibly startled. "Sorry, I didn't mean to scare you," James replied, trying to smile, though inside, he felt uncertain. "It's okay," Catherine said, hugging him as if to reassure him everything was fine. "Why are you up so early again? You've been leaving so often and coming back late. Don't you want to spend some time with me?" James asked, trying to understand what was behind her change in behavior. Catherine paused for a moment before responding, "I'm sorry, honey, but I have to work. I want to earn more. Besides, I'm getting a promotion soon. I'll be managing my own small team soon, and I need to be ready for it." James watched as she quickly put on black stockings and a miniskirt, and an unpleasant suspicion began to grow in his mind. Something wasn't right. "Catherine, why are you dressing like this for work? Don't you think it's a bit too revealing?" he asked, unable to hold back his doubts any longer. Catherine looked at him with surprise, as if he didn't understand the importance of her professional image. "This is what my boss Richard requires. He likes it when I look stylish and confident. He even gives me money so I can buy new clothes." James couldn't believe his ears. That can't be true. Why does he care so much? "It's so I can feel confident. I'll be leading a team soon, and I need to look like a leader," Catherine replied calmly, adjusting her skirt. But that wasn't enough for James to let it go. His gaze fell on the new lingerie she held in her hands and showed him. "Look, I bought new lingerie. It's important for me to feel confident," she said. Catherine continued her preparations, but James's anxiety only grew. His suspicions were becoming stronger. He couldn't understand why Catherine was dressing this way and why her boss was treating her like this. And more importantly, why wasn't he getting any answers to his questions? "Don't you think this is too much?" James asked, looking at her everyday style, which seemed overly seductive for office work. "You just don't understand," Catherine replied, her voice devoid of anger or doubt. "It's to help me succeed. I know it might look strange, but it's necessary for my career." Catherine quickly got dressed, applied bright red lipstick, and left the room without looking at James. He stood there, his heart pounding with unease. He watched her through the window, and when she didn't get into her old car again, his concern deepened. She walked to the road, where a luxury business-class car pulled up for her. James felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He was stunned. Catherine was getting into someone else's car and heading to work? It was shocking. He knew he couldn't remain passive any longer. After she left, James stood by the window for a long time, trying to process what had happened. He couldn't understand why her status had changed so quickly. How had she gone from a regular employee to receiving promotions and privileges after starting to work with Richard? James immediately realized he needed to take action. He couldn't just leave things as they were. His suspicions grew, and he decided to conduct his own investigation. Watching her work schedule, he began to question whether his wife was being honest. Over the next few days, James started observing Catherine, trying to gather more evidence. He noticed that she was often out of the house, and her behavior became increasingly strange. Her explanations about work sounded less convincing, and her relationship with Richard seemed more intense. James knew he had to uncover the truth, even if it would break his heart. James began seeking answers and decided to approach Catherine's colleagues. He couldn't ignore his suspicions. The more he thought about how quickly her status at work had changed, the more he felt a troubling premonition. How had she become such an important figure in the company so quickly? And why did her relationship with Richard seem so mysterious? The first step was to talk to the people she worked with. James knew a few of Catherine's colleagues, people he'd met at various events. He reached out to them, hoping they could shed light on the situation. "Hey, James, what are you doing here?" one of Catherine's colleagues, Mike, asked in surprise. Mike was middle-aged, a bit older than James, but he never took things too seriously. "Yeah, I'm here. I need to talk to you about Catherine," James replied with a smile, though he was tense inside. Mike looked a bit puzzled but didn't refuse. "What's going on? She's your wife, right? Is something wrong?" "I just wanted to know how she's doing at work. She's been working a lot lately, and it seems like her status has changed," James said, trying not to sound too suspicious. "Oh, yeah, she's definitely gotten a promotion," Mike began. "She's now heading a small team and has practically become Richard's right hand. She even has her own private office now. She's really stepped up, dresses sharp, and looks very confident." James felt his heart grow heavier. From the beginning, he'd suspected something was off between Catherine and her boss. "I didn't know that. She rarely tells me. It's great that she has her own office now, but why is it connected to Richard's office? That seems a little odd." Mike paused for a moment and then quietly said, "Well, James, sometimes things happen behind closed doors. They work together a lot, and sometimes we hear noises from that office, like shouting." James felt a chill run down his spine. He couldn't believe his ears. "What? What kind of shouting?" "I don't know how to explain it. It's hard to say, but occasionally we hear sounds that resemble shouting. And we hear Catherine's voice. It happens, but we pretend not to notice. Sometimes Catherine comes out of the office looking a bit disheveled, like her lipstick smudged or her hair messed up." "Disheveled?" James repeated, unable to believe what he was hearing. "Yeah, she looks like someone upset her or something. I don't want to scare you, but this has happened more than once. I just don't know what's going on in there. But something definitely is, and it's concerning," Mike continued, lowering his gaze. James felt as though the ground had disappeared beneath him. He'd started doubting his instincts, but this made everything clearer. Catherine and Richard, something was definitely going on between them, and James was sure it wasn't just a professional relationship. "I don't even know what to say. Thanks for the information, Mike," James said, unsure whether to believe all these rumors. But something inside him told him it wasn't just gossip. "Got it. If you want, you can talk to others. Not all of us are that close to Catherine, but some people have seen similar things," Mike added. After which James left the office feeling completely lost. James spent hours alone, trying to process what he had heard. He became increasingly convinced that Catherine was hiding something from him. Her relationship with Richard was not only suspicious, but also troubling. How had he not noticed these changes earlier? That evening, James decided to confront Catherine again, hoping to get the truth from her. He knew it might be hard for her to admit that her relationship with Richard had taken on a more personal nature, but he was ready for it. "Catherine, we need to talk," James began as she returned from work. "About what?" she replied, sensing the tension in his voice. "About your job. I feel like there's something more than just a professional relationship between you and Richard," James said, unsure if he'd chosen the right moment. Catherine fell silent for a few seconds, her expression shifting. "Have you been spying on me?" she asked, her voice cold. "I heard from your colleagues that something is going on between you two." "I want to know the truth," James said, trying to keep his nerves in check. "It's not what you think. I'm working. I'm focused on my career. Richard is my boss, and that's all there is between us," she replied, avoiding his gaze. "Then why do you look uncomfortable when you come out of his office? And why is it hard to recognize you sometimes when you come home?" James pressed on. Catherine recoiled, her eyes turning colder. "That's none of your business," she snapped. It hit James. She wasn't going to confess. He could feel the truth lurking behind her harsh words and indifference. James wanted to meet this Richard, but he didn't know how to approach it. One day, he brought it up with Catherine, saying, "I'd like to meet your boss, Mr. Richard." Catherine responded that there might be an opportunity later, but for now, they were working on a major project, and she needed to focus on ensuring its success. Catherine also mentioned that she would be spending the upcoming weekend with a friend, and that they planned to go to a spa together to relax. James raised an eyebrow. "Why with a friend? Why don't we go together instead?" Catherine refused, saying they had planned it a long time ago. James agreed outwardly, but, deep down, he no longer trusted Catherine and suspected her of infidelity, though he had no concrete evidence. When the weekend arrived, and Catherine left for the spa, James decided to check her laptop again while she was away. Sitting alone on the couch in their apartment, James felt his heart racing, not just from excitement but also from anxiety. The messages he had seen on Catherine's phone kept replaying in his mind. Thank him for the spa? Is he joining us? These thoughts consumed him as he tried to make sense of it all. Catherine had always been confident, but her emotional detachment only fueled James's suspicions. He couldn't understand why she chose to go to the spa with a friend now. It sounded so casual, so innocent, yet he couldn't take it at face value anymore. The idea that Richard, her boss, might be joining them at the spa only deepened his unease. Was this all just a coincidence? Don't say anything to her. Stay calm. Everything is under control, James told himself, trying to steady his nerves. He returned to Catherine's laptop and carefully went through her messages. At first, he found typical work-related correspondence, but then he stumbled upon one message that made his heart race again. It was a short text from Richard. "Maybe I'll join you at the spa, but we'll see how my schedule looks." James felt a headache coming on. He went back to Catherine's laptop and began combing through more messages. Most of their conversations appeared strictly professional until he noticed a few that seemed more personal. In one exchange, Catherine thanked Richard for his support at work and even added a smiley face, which James found unsettling. What kind of support is this? He thought. Why is she writing to him like this? His nerves were fraying, but James knew he had to proceed cautiously. He resolved to appear calm, even if his emotions were boiling inside. He had made up his mind. He wouldn't confront Catherine about his suspicions. Instead, he planned to meet Richard in person. It was the only way to uncover the truth. The next day, James decided to act. He knew he couldn't just walk up to Richard and ask about his relationship with Catherine. Instead, he found out about an event where Richard was expected to be present. He arranged to attend the event, intending to appear there accidentally, not wanting to arouse suspicion. The evening arrived quickly. James put on a suit, left the house, and headed to the venue. He observed the crowd, searching for Richard among them. He figured Richard would stand out, confident, charismatic, and commanding attention. Just as James began to lose hope, he spotted Richard standing near the bar. Richard was impeccably dressed in an elegant suit, exuding an air of authority. James watched him for a moment before gathering the courage to approach. "Excuse me, Richard? I'm James, Catherine's husband," James said, trying to remain composed. Richard looked surprised but smiled. "Ah, yes, of course. I've heard a lot about you. Catherine is an excellent employee, very hardworking. Thank you for saying that. I've been wanting to meet you for a while. I think we should talk about her work, if you have a moment," James replied, though his true intention was to learn more about their relationship. "Of course, let's talk," Richard replied, smiling slightly tensely. "But honestly, I'm taking a quick break from work right now. I don't think this is the best moment for a serious conversation." James studied his expression. Everything seemed normal, but something still didn't sit right with him. "Don't worry, I understand if it's inconvenient for you," James replied. They engaged in light conversation for a few minutes, and James began to notice that Richard genuinely seemed very focused on his work. They discussed business topics, but James kept other questions lingering in his mind. Finally, James decided he needed to learn more and stepped away from Richard, saying, "Thank you for the chat, Richard. I hope we can talk again sometime." He remained in the hall, watching Richard and trying to analyze his every move. James realized that he might not uncover the full truth that evening, but he was now convinced that Richard was more than just Catherine's boss. When James returned home, he tried to appear calm, though doubts gnawed at him inside. Catherine hadn't yet returned from the spa, and he decided to leave everything as it was for now. James sat in a large armchair, his gaze fixed on the blank TV screen. His mind raced with thoughts, intertwining with one another. He regretted not being able to have a deeper conversation with Richard, or finding out whether Richard had been at the spa with Catherine while she was there. Richard was such a busy man that even when James tried to arrange a meeting, it never worked out, either due to Richard's schedule or James's own lack of opportunity. What mattered now was observing Catherine's behavior and looking for clues. The next day, when Catherine returned from her trip, James noticed a change in her demeanor. She was even more radiant than usual, with a relaxed expression as though the getaway had truly done its job. She looked refreshed and energized, her eyes holding an indescribable gleam. She brought James a gift, a new book he had wanted to read for a long time, which soothed him a little. He kissed her, heard her gentle laugh, and for a few minutes, forgot his suspicions. Catherine started asking him about how he'd spent his time while she was away. James hesitated for a moment. Should he bring up Richard now? He didn't want to come across as pushy, but he felt the need to clarify this issue. "I went to that exhibition," James began, casually deflecting from the topic. "The one you told me about. Richard was there, and we spoke briefly." Catherine's expression suddenly changed. At first, it was just a moment of confusion, but then, as if some unpleasant thought crossed her mind, she began to blush. James noticed her reaction and felt his heartbeat quicken. Something wasn't right. "And what did he say to you?" Catherine asked, her voice steady but with a noticeable effort to control her emotions. "We just introduced ourselves. I wanted to talk to him, but it didn't really work out," James replied, downplaying it as much as possible. "That's all. There wasn't much time." Catherine didn't respond. She paused for a moment, as if she were mulling something over. Then she looked back at him and said, "That's odd. He's a very busy man, James. Why would you want to talk to him?" James felt the pressure in his chest growing stronger. Something about this situation felt off. His gaze became more probing. "And why shouldn't I get to know him?" James asked, looking at Catherine with mild surprise. She quickly averted her gaze. It was so obvious that Catherine was trying to hide something, but her reaction didn't seem like someone who simply didn't want to engage with an unfamiliar person. It was an attempt to avoid something deeper. "It's just not the right time," Catherine said, smiling faintly, but it was a weak smile. "I told you, we're very busy right now. Maybe another time there will be a chance to meet him." James felt his heart racing. It was yet another explanation that didn't sound convincing. Catherine was clearly hiding something. He decided it was time to figure this out, but he knew he had to be patient. He didn't want to act rashly. He needed more evidence, more clues, to avoid coming across as paranoid. At that moment, James resolved that instead of pressing Catherine or confronting her outright, he would wait for another opportunity to uncover the truth. He knew Richard would play a role in this story. But how? And why didn't Catherine want him to speak with Richard? Over the next few days, James observed his wife as she carried on as if everything was fine. She was busy with work, her schedule was packed, and they only saw each other in the evenings. However, James noticed that Catherine frequently glanced at her phone, sometimes laughing at messages, though she would quickly hide it whenever he approached. It seemed strange, and even though James didn't want to jump to conclusions, something was definitely off. Several times he tried to ask about her weekend plans or suggest spending time together, but Catherine always had a reason why it wasn't possible. She said she needed to work or had already planned outings with friends. James couldn't postpone the issue any longer. He was determined to find out what was really going on. So, he decided to act in his own way, quietly and discreetly, but with the resolve to uncover the truth. Catherine returned home after a long day at work, looking as though she had just come back from a fashionable party. Her stylish clothes, new accessories, and sparkling eyes didn't escape James's notice. He immediately saw that something had changed. Her red handbag looked expensive, and a luxurious new bracelet gleamed on her wrist. He couldn't put his finger on it, but she seemed slightly different, more confident, even more distant. "You look amazing," James said, smiling as Catherine walked into the apartment. "Thank you, sweetheart," she replied, walking up to him and kissing him on the cheek. "My boss gave me a new iPhone," she added, placing her bag on the table. James raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Wow, that's cool. What's the occasion?" he asked, trying to mask his curiosity. He knew some gifts between co-workers could have complicated implications, but he tried to appear calm. "It's because I've been doing great work," Catherine said with a smile, lightly waving the iPhone. "He's been really pleased with my performance lately. I've been working so much more and earning a lot too. He even increased my bonus. Maybe he just appreciates the way I work." Her voice was confident, even slightly smug. "That's seriously impressive," James said, though his intuition was now on high alert. She had changed. Catherine seemed different, and this change didn't feel harmless. Something about her tone, her demeanor, made him think deeply. "Yeah, and we just finished a huge project successfully," Catherine continued, her eyes glowing with pride. "They even gave me a bonus, $150,000. Can you imagine?" James couldn't believe his ears. $150,000? It felt like his entire world was suddenly shifting. "That's insane. Are you serious?" he asked, lowering his voice slightly, as though afraid Catherine might notice his true reaction to the news. "Yes, and because of that, the company is organizing a big party. It's going to be huge. All the important people will be there." "Of course, I want to go," Catherine added, laying some documents on the table. "Maybe I could come too?" James asked, his interest unmistakable. He already felt that this might be his chance to immerse himself in the world that had so far been out of his reach. If there was even the slightest chance of learning more about her relationship with Richard, he couldn't miss it. Catherine paused for a moment, looking at him with slight hesitation. "Maybe. I can ask Richard if there's room for you. But I can't promise anything because this party might not be the right setting for everyone," she said, her tone cautious in a way that immediately unsettled James. In that moment, James felt that this party could be pivotal. He needed to be there to see everything for himself, to understand who Richard really was and what kind of relationship his wife had with him. The following days were a test of patience for James. He tried not to show too much interest, but every time Catherine mentioned Richard or talked about the company, he caught inconsistencies in her stories. She frequently talked about her meetings with him and how they were working together on major projects. There was a peculiar tone in her voice during these stories that didn't sit well with James. One evening, while at home, James noticed Catherine pulling out her new iPhone and quickly typing messages. She was deeply focused, and when he approached her, she immediately stopped and put the phone away. "Still working?" James asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Yeah, just some minor things." "Everything's fine," she replied, but her gaze seemed distant. That's when James decided to take action. He knew he needed to get into that party. But how? He had to find a way that would make it impossible for Catherine to refuse without raising any suspicions. Over the next few days, he prepared himself. He had always been attentive to details, and he suspected that the party would be the moment when he would finally uncover what was really happening between Catherine and her boss Richard. He decided that he would be so discreet and observant that even if Catherine didn't want him there, he would find a way to attend. Eventually, Catherine agreed to let James join her at the party, but something about her conditions unsettled him. She told him she would arrive separately because she would be attending as a VIP guest, while he would only be a regular attendee. James didn't like it, but he agreed nonetheless. He needed to be there. The day of the party arrived, and as always, Catherine looked stunning. She dressed in all-new clothes and left the house for the event. James watched her get into an expensive car and drive away. He followed later, arriving at the venue after her. The hall was massive, filled with music, dancing, alcohol, and a crowd of people. James stood near the bar, his heart pounding faster as he observed Richard and Catherine laughing together and whispering as if no one else existed. It was so overt yet so deceitful that even James's attempts to remain calm seemed impossible. He watched as she embraced Richard, her hands gently brushing his shoulders, her eyes sparkling with admiration as she looked at him. This can't be real, James thought. Maybe I'm imagining things? Maybe I'm overthinking? But deep down, he already knew he wasn't imagining anything. You can't just stand there and watch this anymore, James thought as he stepped closer to Richard, who was standing by the bar, sipping a cocktail and chatting with someone. Catherine had stepped away for a moment, apparently to be alone for a bit. James approached Richard, unable to hide his irritation, and began. "What's going on between you and Catherine?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady, but it trembled slightly. Richard turned to him with a cold smile. "And what is going on between us? Do you want to know?" he replied sharply, his tone brusque. "I'm not going to discuss my personal affairs with you, James." James couldn't hold back. He raised his voice. "Personal? I thought you had a professional relationship. What's happening, Richard? What's between you two? Is it just work, or is there more?" Richard smirked, his gaze growing colder. He clenched his fists and replied, "Your wife is no longer yours. She's mine. Can't you see that?" Richard glanced toward Catherine, who was now approaching them. "She's in love with me. And by the way, she's leaving with me tonight." James stood as if paralyzed, unable to say a word. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat like a gasp for air. He stared at Richard, not believing what he was hearing. "This can't be true," James whispered, still trying to find some logic in Richard's words. Richard took another step forward, as if to confirm his statement. He scoffed. "You're weak, James. She deserves more. You can no longer give her what she needs. She's with me now." Without waiting for a reaction, Richard turned and walked toward Catherine, who had now returned. With a light touch, he took her hand, and they left the party together, leaving James standing there, frozen in place. James felt his world shatter into pieces. He couldn't believe this was really happening. He still couldn't understand how it had come to this. How could Catherine, his wife, change her feelings toward him so easily? How had she managed to hide all of this? And, most importantly, how had he failed to notice what had been happening right under his nose? Anger and heartbreak consumed him, but in that moment, he couldn't afford to crumble. He felt he had to follow them. Maybe this wasn't the end. He needed to know everything. He couldn't let this go unanswered. A few minutes after Catherine and Richard disappeared from view, James left the party. He didn't search for them in the parking lot, but he was certain they would leave together. He got into his car and began to follow them. He drove carefully, keeping his distance but never losing sight of them. He saw Richard and Catherine pull up to an upscale hotel. James parked nearby and got out of his car. He tried not to be noticed, but the need to see everything for himself drove him forward. As Catherine and Richard entered the hotel lobby, James quietly followed them. They entered an elevator and went up to the top floor. James waited a few minutes to avoid drawing attention, then approached the door to their room. He felt a wave of fear wash over him, but he decided that if he didn't confront this now, he might never get another chance to uncover the truth. Pressing his ear to the door, he listened intently. Suddenly, the door opened, and he saw them entering the room together. Catherine and Richard walked inside, and in that moment, James realized that his suspicions were not unfounded. This was reality. James stood outside the hotel room door, his heart pounding harder with each passing second. Just moments ago, he had watched Richard and Catherine enter this room. His mind raced with questions. How long had this been going on? How could she have done this while hiding it from him? They had been together for 5 years, and he had never suspected anything like this. Taking a deep breath and summoning his courage, James knocked on the door. The silence in the corridor was deafening. He waited, counting the seconds. After 20 minutes, he couldn't take it anymore and decided to act. James stepped forward and knocked again, saying, "Room service. I'm here about your order." The silence behind the door lingered, and James thought they might not open. But then, the door swung open, and there stood Richard, his expression almost nonchalant. "What do you want?" Richard asked, looking slightly surprised but not intimidated. James didn't answer the question. Without giving Richard a chance to react, he pushed him aside and entered the room. The door swung open wide, and James saw what he had been trying to deny to himself, but now it was undeniable. Catherine stood in the middle of the room in her underwear, her face slightly flushed, her eyes wide with shock as she looked at him. Richard, meanwhile, stepped back into the room behind James, clenching his fists. "What are you doing?" Richard said, trying to remain calm, but there was clear anger in his voice. "You have no right to be here." James didn't respond to Richard's words. His gaze was fixed on Catherine, and he felt his world shift as he saw her like this. Her appearance seemed to confirm everything he had been trying to deny. "Is it true?" he asked quietly, but his voice was laced with hatred. "Are you cheating on me with him?" Catherine looked flustered. She tried to cover herself with her hand, but James's cold gaze pinned her in place, and she realized she couldn't hide her emotions. Her lips trembled, and her eyes avoided his. "James!" Her voice broke, and she fell silent, unsure of where to begin. Richard stepped forward, standing between them as if to shield Catherine. "You don't get it, James. She made her choice. You were just someone who gave her stability." "I give her what she really wants," Richard said with a smug smile. James flinched at those words. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt, but also the sheer disdain Richard showed for him. "And do you have anything to say to me?" James asked Catherine when her eyes met his again. She looked up at him, her face filled with disappointment but also indignation. "You don't understand. I haven't been happy with you for a long time, James. You're too caught up in your work, your world. I didn't want this to happen, but it just did." Catherine couldn't bring herself to look him in the eye. James understood that she was trying to justify her actions, but it didn't ease the pain. "You didn't even have the courage to tell me this to my face, did you?" James stepped back, realizing her words were meaningless. He no longer heard her explanations. The silence in the room was broken by Richard, who stepped closer to James with a defiant look. "You can't change anything, James. Catherine is mine now. You have no claim to her anymore." James stared at Richard, feeling as though he had been punched in the face. All those years of giving his all, unaware of the betrayal, now seemed wasted. Richard turned to Catherine and said softly, "Let's go, Catherine. We don't need to stay here any longer." Catherine looked at James for a few seconds, but then, without saying another word, followed Richard out. James remained standing in the middle of the room, staring at the remnants of a shared life that was now over. His soul churned with emotion, but there was nothing left to change. James stood motionless for a moment, then left the hotel room, feeling like his life had been irreversibly altered. The next day, James stood in the empty room of his home. Catherine's belongings lay scattered on the floor or had already been removed. His hands trembled with anger and despair, but he couldn't stop himself. He was throwing everything out: her photos, books, clothes, everything that reminded him of her presence. With each step, each item discarded, his anger subsided a little, but it didn't make things easier. It felt like a futile attempt to regain control of a situation that had spiraled beyond his grasp. He stopped in front of the large mirror in the hallway, which was next to her photographs. His reflection didn't look the same as always. He barely recognized himself. The man staring back at him was someone trying to escape a reality he didn't want to face. Now, He was alone, and Catherine was no longer a part of his world. James stepped outside and watched as her belongings were scattered across the lawn. Each glance at the items reminded him that he had lost more than just a woman. He had lost his faith that relationships could be real, without deceit or betrayal. His hands trembled again, and he couldn't stop himself. He looked at her bags, leather shoes, and favorite jewelry, remembering how she always chose the best for herself. He imagined her laughing with Richard, discussing what they were doing while he was here, alone, in an empty house. But his thoughts didn't linger for long. As he was about to return to the house, he heard footsteps. He turned and saw Catherine standing at the door. Her face was serious, even slightly embarrassed, but she couldn't hide her pain. She stood there, looking at what remained of her life in this house. "James," she said, her voice soft, almost devoid of emotion. "Have you completely lost your mind?" She glanced at the pile of her belongings now lying on the ground, and something about it seemed to deeply affect her. James stopped, looking at her with a cold stare. He wasn't going to discuss anything with her. The betrayal was too deep a wound to forgive. "Is that all you have to say?" He couldn't help the sarcasm in his voice. "Just come back and tell me I've lost my mind?" Catherine nodded slightly, as if trying to process everything that had happened. "I don't know what you want from me, James, but I understand that you're not ready to accept this," she said, trying to keep her voice calm, though her words were heavy for them both. "Do you understand?" James laughed loudly, trying to hold back his emotions. "What do you understand, Catherine? You cheated on me. If you really understood anything, this wouldn't have happened." Catherine shook her head and looked again at her belongings scattered on the ground. She took a step forward, but James didn't let her come closer. "It's over, Catherine. You made your choice, and I have nothing more to say to you," he said, his voice growing colder with every word. Catherine stepped back, her face emotionless, but her eyes burned with sadness and disappointment. She tried to say something, but she couldn't. Her words no longer mattered, and James knew it. "You're wrong," she said, attempting to maintain her composure. "I know we can't fix everything, but I still want you to understand that I never wanted to hurt you. And maybe I made a mistake." James sighed, looking at her with disappointment. All her words felt hollow. They didn't change anything. She stood before him, trying to act as if there was still something to salvage, but he could see that there was nothing left between them. "I understand everything now," he said, but his voice carried no anger or regret, only emptiness. "Now I know why you were with me." Catherine stepped back again, and James watched as she turned toward her car. She didn't look back as she got into the driver's seat and drove away. That was the last he saw of her. Her departure was final. Are betrayals a part of love in a relationship? Share your thoughts in the comments.